Guys, seriously, there are spoilers in this review, okay? It's not my fucking fault if you keep watching and you go in the comments whinging because I said that Thanos kills Atreus in the end, okay? God of War is a cinematic masterpiece. Kratos is no longer seeking revenge, but rather redemption. He feels multi-dimensional for the first time. God of War is the new technical benchmark on the console. It overwhelms the market with a force that leaves you speechless. Every single aspect in God of War works perfectly in order to create a violent yet moving masterpiece. Where God of War once relied on bombast and bloodlust, now it leaves space for strategy and nuance. It's flawless in its execution and the new benchmark for action titles. God of War has amazed us from the narrative standpoint as well as with its incredible graphics. The new adventure of Kratos redefines the beat-em-all genre. God of War just doesn't feel like the next step for the franchise, but for the entire video game industry. Those moments where I'd find myself traveling further than I set out to and in a surprisingly expansive world no less, had me literally leaping out of my chair. The feel of throwing and recalling the Leviathan axe is so damn satisfying. I sliced an enemy through the head and then proceeded to spend a good 10 minutes just chucking the axe and recalling it in the forest. Forget all previous iterations, this game sets the new franchise standard in which story, combat and exploration are expertly interwoven in spectacular fashion. It's made Kratos relatable enough that I've been caught audibly referring to Atreus as my son several times since the opening hours. Playing on PS4 Pro on a setup like my Samsung QLED 65-inch QHD with HDR, it just screams quality! When I saw God of War shown off again at last year's E3, I gave it the same lukewarm reaction I had the last time they showed it off. Compared to any other game in the series, this new entry looked so dull. Kratos, once a god filled with anger and a lust for revenge, capable of killing things 300 times his size with a few swings of the blades of chaos, now an old man wading through forests helping his son shoot a deer. It felt like such a drastic change in tone that I didn't want to believe that this was the new God of War. It didn't look like it, both in terms of narrative and gameplay. I played the shit out of God of War 2. It was easily one of my most played games as a stinky teenager with pimples on his ass. So coming from that to what essentially looked like The Last of Us Norse edition was a bit of a swift kick to the nads. But I tried to stay optimistic. Maybe I was wrong. God of War had essentially been the same thing 5 times in a row, so maybe it was time for change. In before I don't like change. And seeing more and more footage for it coming out, the combat actually started looking pretty fun and weighty, so one day before it came out, I caved in and ordered it. Seeing all the 10 out of 10s it was getting from almost every media outlet on the internet, I needed to see for myself whether it was really deserving of this near infinite praise, or whether this was another Last of Us situation where the 10s are mostly handed out because the story was really good, despite the actual gameplay being subjectively pretty average in almost every way. And after beating the main story, I can safely say I was kind of wrong. And kind of right. God of War has so much cool shit happening that if it were only that cool shit, it would honestly maybe be a 10 out of 10, or at least a 9 on whatever stupid rating system we use these days. But there's also a lot that I really disliked about God of War, mostly to do with the combat and the blurred line between movie and video game. It falls into a lot of traps that AAA games commonly fall into these days, but at the same time, I was pleasantly surprised to actually find a game underneath all that fluff. Imagine, a game that actually has somewhat enjoyable and thoughtful gameplay. Who'd have thought it in this dystopian $100 movies with interactive moments world we live in? He says, happily clutching his copy of Detroit Become Human, which he purchased at launch. I'm such a fucking trash bag. The premise of the game this time around isn't necessarily as grandiose as cutting off the heads of gods, scooping the innards out of their skulls and serving up banana daiquiris in them, but instead something much more somber. Kratos, now living in secrecy in the Norse realm of Midgard after turning the entire population of Greece into level decor for the next Doom, journeys to scatter the ashes of his deceased wife from the highest peak in all the realm, while bringing his son Atreus along and teaching him how to survive in this harsh land. The way the game starts is quite the contrast to the older God of War games. In those you'd get a minute or two of cutscenes before being plopped into a fight and told to unleash your anger on the square and triangle buttons, but Dead of Boy starts with Kratos chopping down a tree, staring at his wrists for a solid minute to remind you that, hey, the old games were a thing, tying formerly mentioned tree to a boat, rowing back home and cremating his deceased wife. In fact, it takes a good 15 to 20 minutes to actually get to your first combat scenario. The way this intro played out, I was convinced that Dead of Boy was going to focus more on the story than any actual gameplay, forcibly pushing me along a linear path, drowning me in cutscenes, and occasionally giving me an opportunity to juggle some Draugr, and for the first couple hours it certainly somewhat felt like that. But I was pleasantly surprised that Dead of Boy was keen to show me that it hadn't forgotten how to be a game, as the combat, while perhaps not quite as flashy as previous games, is surprisingly deep and mechanically satisfying, though not without its faults. You've got your standard light and heavy attack, light attacks being good for dealing damage quickly and heavy attacks used for juggling smaller foes. You also have the ability to throw your axe, used not only for solving puzzles, but striking enemies from a distance before recalling it to your hand again with a tap of the triangle button. I made fun of IGN and the whole "I spent 10 minutes throwing the axe because it made me come in my I'm proud we gave God Hand a 3 out of 10 undies," but it really does feel satisfying, in more of a hitting an enemy in the head than slicing through 3 more enemies on the return trip kind of way, or a throw the axe, bash some heads in with my bare fists and recall the axe mid-combo kind of way. For the first hour or two, there's very little actual nuance to the combat and moves available to you are limited, but more abilities are gradually unlocked, such as dash attacks, charge attacks, ranged attacks, stance changes, and a whole lot more. And this is on top of the runic attacks you can find out in the wild, some being area of effect attacks, others focusing on dealing as much elemental or stun damage as possible. You can even command Boy to fire some arrows to distract enemies with a dedicated Boy button. You can't make this shit up. I was worried that some of the moves, especially the stance changes, would end up underutilized in combat, but I ended up using them more often than I thought. It also has a brilliant sense of weight and impact, which I believe the earlier games lacked, making even the most simple of encounters a joy to push through. Overall, I enjoy the combat in Dad of Boy, but man, do I have some hang-ups about it. For one, the camera perspective is horrible for this type of game. I'm sorry, but it really is. The over-the-shoulder camera usually reserved for shooters introduces 2 big problems that can make some combat situations way more frustrating than they should be. One, Kratos, for some reason, strafes. I'm assuming this is because of the axe throwing mechanic, but this means he can only attack in a general 90-degree area facing forward. He can't attack to his left or right or behind him without turning the camera. Obviously, you have an extremely narrow field of vision, and because of this, you flat out can't see enemies coming up from behind. Hack and slash games such as Bayonetta and Devil May Cry usually stick to either a fixed angle or a camera system that centers the player in the middle of the screen, making it easy to see enemies coming from any angle and giving you ample opportunity to react. You don't get that luxury here. It's especially annoying with some of the faster enemies, as well as enemies who fling ranged attacks at you, which you'll never see coming. The developers obviously knew this was an issue because they added a couple features to counteract it, namely the massive indicators that appear down the bottom and warn you of incoming attacks and projectiles that you can't see, which are eerily similar to the icons that indicate opponents behind you in games like Forza or Drive Club. Uh-oh, it just turned red, better mash circle to dodge and hope I don't get fucking obliterated by that thing I can't see. Your boy's got some more complaints. Listen, stop your groaning, okay? I criticize because I care. The game's default control scheme places light and heavy attacks on R1 and R2, yes, just like Dark Souls, while Axe, Recall, and Boy button are set to square and triangle. Personally, I never liked the Dark Souls control method, it's hella lame, so I swapped it so that I attack with square and triangle instead. This feels more natural, but puts me at a disadvantage in any situation where I want to throw my axe at an enemy, because lining up your shot and pressing square to throw requires me to take my thumb off the right stick and press square. Meanwhile, the enemy's already step to the side and I throw my axe into the wall like a fucking dork. I ended up having to crab claw that shit sometimes, which is something no one should ever expect to do unless playing Monster Hunter on the PSP. For the sake of accessibility, I would appreciate a feature that briefly changes the attack buttons back to R1 and R2 while holding L2 to aim, then changing back once I let go. The enemy designs on offer here are great, but there just isn't enough of it. There's kind of enough variety between standard enemies, though some of them get predictable and repetitive towards the end, but where they really stumble is the boss fights. They don't quite reach the heights of bosses from previous games, especially in terms of scale, but if they existed in their own vacuum, I guess you could consider them decent bosses. The problem is that there just isn't enough of them. This troll boss is used like 10 times throughout the entire game, maybe more. The first time you fight it, it's alright, but then they decide that it's totally fine to just recycle this boss, maybe give it an elemental affinity, or the ability to teleport, or maybe even chuck a few enemies in there to add quote-unquote difficulty. The last troll you fight is just as hard as the first troll you fight, except maybe with a bit more health. And the other boss fights aren't terribly exciting either. There's a part where you fight a dragon, which is the only time Dad of Boy comes remotely close to matching the scale of an older God of War boss fight, and it's just a matter of waiting for him to attack, then throwing something at him, or maybe cutting his nails as a friendly gesture. There are maybe 2 times where I was legitimately impressed with a boss fight, and it was at the very beginning and end of the game. These 2 fights are incredibly fun boss fights that keep you on your toes the whole time, and it's a shame that every other boss, excluding maybe the hidden Valkyries, are so comparatively mediocre, because amazing boss fights is a staple of this series, and to see Dad of Boy not carry on that legacy is a true shame. I don't think I have any other criticisms about the combat, except I would have preferred that they tie runic attacks to a meter instead of cooldown times, because some of these cooldown times are far too long and it really feels like you're in control of them. But like I said, the combat feels great at its core. It's just that I think they could have cut less corners with the enemy design, and they really should have gone with anything else other than the over-the-shoulder perspective. I could have overlooked its faults much more easily then, but as it is, when Dad of Boy's combat works, it works. And it works well. Once you get a couple of hours in, the game opens up by plopping you on a lake with a whole bunch of different locations for you to explore, with more becoming available the more you progress. It wouldn't be a game in 2018 without some sort of open world structure, and while I hesitate to label Father and Son open world, it definitely feels reminiscent of one at times. Whenever you open the map, there's a nice big checklist of all the collectibles in the realm, practically begging you to tick it off. I didn't. I couldn't have been asked personally, I don't have the time, I have other weebier games to play. I found a bunch of chests to increase my max health a bit, and some other chests containing runic abilities, and I got through the game just fine. It's totally not mandatory, at least not on the default difficulty, so if you just want to tackle the story, don't feel like you're obligated to track all these down. The game feels satisfying enough if you just want to do the main story, but that said, the side stuff itself is pretty fun if you feel like going for it. I spent about an hour just running around on this little group of islands, solving a couple of puzzles, finding treasure, and being slain by powerful enemies. Yeah, Dad Boy does that whole watch out for enemies that are twice as strong as you and will wipe the ass with your face thing, which I don't know, it's not particularly good game design, but I digress. But yeah, there's some light RPG elements happening this time around as well, and admittedly they are very light and you can get away without pouring a lot of attention into it, at least for the main story. The gear that you'll find, craft and upgrade usually focus on one or two particular stats, such as strength and vitality, meaning you can create your own builds if you truly care. I got away with equipping whatever gave me more strength, runic and cooldown, which means my vitality was always quite low, but I could at least dish out a bajillion times more than I could take. Personally, I could have done without all the stats and crafting and whatnot, and instead I think the game could have delegated chests to XP, kinda like how older games did it with red orb chests, on top of the already existing chests containing runic attacks. This would serve to make XP more valuable, because in reality, while you don't get much during the start of the game, you end up getting bucket loads about a third of the way through. Once you level up your axe, which happens a couple of times throughout your adventure, you can essentially just jump in there and buy all the skills that just unlocked while still having enough to spend on the boys skill tree, resulting in an XP system that feels somewhat superfluous. To me, this is a game, like Nier, that's trying to be an RPG when it doesn't particularly need to be one. I know I'm sort of shitting all over Dad Boy right now, but honestly I don't really have much more to say about the actual gameplay, so I want to move on to the story and presentation. And I'll tell you what, I have far less complaints here. The graphics, beautiful, beautiful. 10 out of 10, 13 out of 10. The level of detail on literally anything and everything is staggering. Some of the environments were legitimately awe-inspiring, and a lot of them have such amazing use of color that you really don't get in these AAA games anymore, as well as a dazzling lighting system to back everything up. Simply being able to take in the view in some of these set pieces more than made up for the fact that the game is forcing me to walk at its own pace at the time. All the footage you're seeing here was recorded at 1080p, so it might not look as crisp as it does in person, which I tell you what, playing it with super sampling mode on was totally worth getting a PS4 Pro for. It's so buttery smooth, it may as well have been a piece of fucking toast. But if you don't have a PS4 Pro, then the game still looks fucking gorgeous anyway. The main difference between the PS4 and PS4 Pro here is that the Pro can sacrifice a teeny bit of graphical fidelity for an unlocked frame rate, which, to be honest, is not at all worth it. There are moments where it manages to hit 60 FPS, but most of the time it's fluctuating between 40 and 50, even dipping down to 30 again in particularly intense fights and cutscenes. Some people may prefer it, some people are also fucking weird. Either way, I honestly suggest just keeping it locked at 30. You don't need 60 FPS for this, it plays just fine without it. This gorgeous world is the backdrop for a surprisingly good story too. Now, I'm not gonna go as far to say that Dad Boy has an amazing story that revolutionizes narrative storytelling in video games, because it's really not that great. It's just good. It's good. What do you want? It's good, alright? It's good. The dynamic between Kratos and his boy Atreus is ever present and the backbone to the story. While they may be traveling to the highest peak in all the realms to scatter the ashes of their deceased mother/wife, we don't care about that. We just want to see Dad and boy learn to love each other, you know? Do it! Do it, Kratos, you fucking useless sack of shit! Do it! Do it! Kratos and his boys' personalities play well against each other. While Kratos is determined and finds absolutely no humor in any situation he finds himself in, Atreus is infinitely more positive and wants to help everyone he meets, much to the dismay of Kratos, who doesn't do the whole communication thing very well. There's also a third member in this little party, Mimir, the god of knowledge, whom you may have noticed hanging off of Kratos' backside. For being nothing more than a head, he's a surprisingly likable and kind of funny character, injecting just enough light humor into the game without feeling out of place. They have a really good dynamic, it's nice. Atreus is like, "Am I getting better, father?" And Kratos is like, "Boy, you are not ready." And Mimir is all like, "You two need to learn to get along." And boy is like, "Wow, we should help that guy out." And Dad is all like, "Stay focused, boy." And Head is all like, "We must travel to the realm of the MacGuffinheim to find the MacGuffin we need." It's fun. They have some fun. It's nice. Oh, he's been talking about good stuff for too long. Here comes a negative. Get ready for it. Get ready for it. I don't really like that the entire game is a continuous camera shot. Yep. There it is. Listen, don't get me wrong. It's technically impressive, and there are scenes, particularly the fight against the stranger in the beginning of the game, where it's used effectively. That fight is fucking amazing. But the entire game being presented as a continuous shot without any cuts whatsoever occasionally bogs down the pace of the game, or makes it seem a little unnatural, and also limits ways in which this particular story can be told. For one, you're with Kratos every step of the way, for better and for worse. There's a part in the game where Atreus falls sick, and you have to carry him a fair distance to someone who can help him. This means a good 5 minutes of almost nothing but walking and rowing, when in reality, throwing the game into a cutscene and showing a few quick cuts of Kratos making his way there would have sufficed. It also means a few cutscenes stretch on just a little longer than they should have. This is a problem I had with Metal Gear Solid 5, which also did the continuous shot thing, although it was contained within separate cutscenes instead of the entire game. But for example, during the opening hour, something's about to happen and this dude in the bandages would say, "Come on!" And then the camera slowly swings over to Big Boss, who's standing there like a slack-jawed yokel, waiting for the camera to position itself behind him so the player can take control. Listen, I get it, you're proud of your continuous shot, boys, and it is very impressive, but don't be afraid to use camera cuts every now and then. Well-timed cuts and camera positioning can lead to all sorts of interesting narrative moments all on their own that a continuous shot wouldn't really be capable of. I think overall the story is pretty enjoyable, but this isn't the most amazing thing I've ever seen like some people seem to be suggesting. It's actually a pretty standard plot for a video game, usually revolving around reaching a roadblock then having to go find a way to get past said roadblock, which happens a lot. By the way, you'll even end up traveling to a whole other realm just to get past one of these roadblocks. And of course, we have to address the elephant in the room, or I guess the boy in the room.
Boy?
Yeah, Kratos says boy a lot. In fact, I don't think he really likes to address anybody by name in this game, from boy to woman to dwarf to head. It's completely dumb, impossible to ignore, and occasionally maybe even ruins dramatic tension, but it's fucking funny to be honest. In this day and age of the word boy being the funniest fucking thing to man-children such as myself, the same kind of people who enjoy the E meme, the dialogue becomes the most unintentionally funny thing in the world. The one other thing I want to briefly touch on is how the media seems to be reacting to God of War. Many different sites have blown this whole thing out of proportion, praising God of War left and right and bringing forth a whole bunch of misconceptions in an attempt to both downplay the previous entries in the series and raise God of War to a status that, in my and a lot of others' opinions, it truly doesn't deserve. Stupid shit like saying, Kratos has matured, the story is more mature, Kratos isn't some big fucking brute waving his whip swords around for the hell of it anymore. None of this is even remotely true, and honestly, kind of disappointing. Over the course of the previous 5 games, Kratos undergoes an amazing thing some people may not have heard of called a character arc. In the first game, we can sympathize with Kratos. He wants to get revenge on Ares, the former god of war, for tricking him into killing his wife and daughter. And even in Chains of Olympus on the PSP, the game uses its own mechanics in an attempt to convey emotion, as you're given a choice to relinquish your powers and be with your deceased daughter at the cost of mankind, or mash circle to push her away and leave her once more. But by the time God of War 3 comes around, you're starting to question Kratos' actions. He's not the hero you may have originally perceived him to be. For some reason, the media seem to think that the older game's story doesn't hold up as well because it's about revenge, whereas the new God of War tells a story of redemption instead, which is one of the stupidest fucking things I've heard all year. The same year in which I heard that UK residents could pop down to the local newsagents and pick up a temporary porn license so they can have a pull. Contrary to what you may be reading, Kratos, while not the deepest character ever, is significantly deeper than most reviews and articles give him credit. And not only Kratos as a character, but the games themselves. This is explained masterfully in a video by Endless Jess, which you can hopefully find up here somewhere, as well as in the description, but it is well worth a watch. It's a great deconstruction of the God of War narrative as a whole, and also the utter bullshit that most media outlets seem to be spewing about the new God of War. Like, I'm loosely paraphrasing here, but all these review sites are pretty much claiming that the new God of War has finally made this series great, and that the older games were never anything particularly noteworthy, and yet, with the exception of God of War Ascension, which still scored well, every game in the series has received critical acclaim across the board. I simply don't understand. I don't think any of us understand. I don't think we ever will understand. I know it sounds like I fucking hate Dead of Boy to its very core by this point, but no, I honestly really liked it. God of War is not only a great game on its own, but an excellent continuation of the previous game's story while still functioning perfectly fine as a standalone title for newcomers. There were far too many times where I was fighting the same boss for the 27th time or being forced to walk at a pace that would make all the people who walk as slowly as possible down the middle of aisles at the supermarket scoff in disgust, but they're heavily outweighed by the good bits. The dynamic between Kratos and his son can be genuinely heartwarming. The world looks amazing and is fun to explore, and combat, when it works, is immensely satisfying. There's some very obvious sequel bait at the end of the game, and judging by how well this game has already sold, we're definitely getting that sequel at some point, which is good news in my opinion, because I'd like Santa Monica Studios to look back at what they've done and be proud, but also to hopefully realize Dead of Boy's flaws and improve upon them for the sequel. Because if they can do that, then God of War 2, or 5, or whatever the fuck it gets called, will totally be worth all the inevitable 10 out of 10s it'll get. Anyway, good game, can recommend. Buy it for your dad for his birthday or something, so he can watch the relationship between Kratos and his boy and be forced to reflect on all the times he beat you over the ass with his bare hands and realize what a terrible father has become. Time to add to my ever-growing list of game reviewers who have way less subs than they deserve. This week, fortnight, month, whatever, I'd like to point your attention to Grenade Man Blitz. As quoted from his most recent review, he has maybe 8 videos of worth, but those 8 videos are some good quality shit. Reviewing games from series such as Mega Man and Spyro with some funny skits and... oh, wait, I've just received confirmation that Nate has in fact played Fortnite on his channel. Alright, never mind then. False alarm, fellas! I kid, go check him out, he's a funny bastard, okay? Seeing as I had 2 Patreon reward tiers that both equated to the same fucking thing for different prices, I decided to change it up a bit. The $2 tier is gone, replaced with a $5 tier that gets you a verbal thank you at the end of my videos, as well as some more rewards coming soon. Also, if I pronounce any of your names wrong, please feel free to slide into my DMs on Twitter or Patreon or Discord or whatever and call me names and tell me my mother smells of semen and shame. So, thank you to Mitchell Reese, Jarden Bramhall, Chatter Estop, Sebastian Orbe, Dylan Irvin, Camacho Gaming, Nathaniel Forrest, Pierre Kratem, Travis Miranda, Thomas Hart, Lazaro Dave, Dalek Boy, The Ruby Red Rose, Laurent and Nation McAltile for your continued support. Also thanks to Tabriz Sadiq and Arse in one hand, Jack in the other. I'm recording this at 3 AM, shut up. Also, get better names. My small brain can't comprehend how to pronounce them. Lamau.